Hi again. Here's a new book I haven't talked about before. It's new to the channel, therefore, but it's been around since 1997. One of David Reed's books, Jehovah-talk, the mind control language of Jehovah's Witnesses. Here's what the blurb says on the back. You can't quite pin it down. The words sound Christian, but with a twist. We have always believed in the divinity of Christ. It is a classic case of Jehovah-talk, the inner theocratic language of the Jehovah's Witnesses. David Reed explains what is being said. When witnesses use the terms deity, divine, or God in reference to Christ, they mean merely that he is a God, in the sense that all angels are superhuman beings or godlike ones, in the sense that Satan, the devil, is the god of this world, according to 2 Corinthians 4, verse 4. In this book, Reed presents an in-depth vocabulary listing and explanation of distinctive terms used by Jehovah's Witnesses. Jehovah-talk is no accident, explains Reed, but a deliberate choice by Jehovah's Witnesses, a so-called pure language. He shows how that language shares the same thought control approach of George Orwell's Newspeak, locking people inside the cult and frustrating those who would speak to them. Jehovah-talk is an essential tool for all who deal with Jehovah's Witnesses in professional or family settings. It will teach you how to overcome hidden language barriers and gain an effective opening for sharing yourself in the gospel. So about 2/3 of the book is taken out with what you could call a string of definitions or a glossary of words that are often redefined by the Watchtower, but also terminology, general terminology that is unique to them. By the way, in case you don't know who David Reed is, he joined the Jehovah's Witnesses out of Harvard and for 14 years was a full-time leader and pioneer for the cult. Since leaving in 1982, he has written numerous books on Jehovah's Witnesses and other cults. Now, we've put several of those books in our basic library for Jehovah's Witnesses, and we'll add this book to that list. And I'll put in a link at the end of this to that basic library for JWs, and a link to my own testimony. His testimony, an expanded version of it, he'd written one in the earlier books, but there's an expanded version in here giving some of his background. Very interesting. He has Unitarian roots. So I hadn't really thought about that before I looked at this book again the other day. Here's what the preface says about the reason this book needed to be written. A man with Jehovah's Witnesses relatives wrote to me recently and described his loved ones as being on the other side of an invisible obstacle like a glass wall. He said he could yell, scream, and pound on the glass without getting any response from them, as if they couldn't even hear what he was saying. This man's experience is not unique. Many who attempt to reason with JW visitors or acquaintances feel that they run up against an invisible obstacle. If you have already read other books on Jehovah's Witnesses and have tried unsuccessfully to share liberating information with them, you may feel discouraged from making further attempts. You may be thinking, why should I bother reading more about JWs? I can never get through to them with what I already know. When I talk to them, it's as if I'm not even speaking their language. If so, you may have correctly identified the invisible obstacle as a language barrier. Yet, it is much more than that. The theocratic language that Watchtower leaders admit teaching their followers is actually an instrument of mind control. It is designed to prevent you from getting through to them and to prevent them from accepting the information you are trying to share with them. Having their own unique language is something that Jehovah's Witnesses share in common with other mind-controlled cults. Yet it is an aspect of the sect that is often missed by Christians who focus on religious differences or doctrinal errors. And partly because they fail to take the effects of mind control into account, these Christians typically find it difficult, if not impossible, to correct those doctrinal errors in the JW's mind. A direct presentation of clear and simple information fails to penetrate the witness's thinking because the thinking process itself has become twisted and distorted. The use of language in mind control is not necessarily a religious issue. Atheistic communist regimes perfected the technique apart from any religious aspirations and used it as one of the psychological weapons they turned against Americans captured during the Korean War. When a captive audience is coerced into listening, the process is termed brainwashing. When the same techniques are used minus the coercive element, the more correct terms are thought reform or mind control. In either case, language plays a key role. Consider, for example, the effect of a single well-chosen name. A regime that calls itself the Democratic People's Republic of Korea trains people to refer to it by that name in order to influence their thinking. Though it forms only a small part of a large mind control propaganda effort, the name itself serves as an obstacle to thinking of the regime as undemocratic. An undemocratic democratic republic is a linguistic contradiction, and the human mind automatically tries to avoid contradictions. Like loaded dice weighted to roll a predetermined number, the loaded language of mind control exerts subtle pressure to induce a predetermined line of thought. To outsiders exposed to a single euphemistic name or a few vocabulary samples, such words are hardly persuasive at all. But to the actual targets of a mind control program, people immersed in propaganda 24 hours a day and cut off from outside influences, the effect can be overwhelming. Because the Bible is familiar ground, Christians prefer to study Scripture for answers to Jehovah's Witnesses rather than to study JW mind control. That preference apparently accounts for the popularity of my book, Jehovah's Witnesses Answered Verse by Verse, with over 100,000 copies circulating in English and nearly an equal number in translated editions. Yet it is that very mind control that prevents JWs from grasping what Christians show them in the Bible. Later in this book, I discuss the case of a witness woman who was asked to open her own New World Translation of the Bible to Revelation 19, verse 1, to determine whether that verse placed the great crowd on earth or in heaven. She read, "great crowd in heaven," and concluded it said they are on earth. Mind control forced her to see the opposite of what actually appeared on the page. This is what Christians are up against when they go to Jehovah's Witnesses with the Bible, but without an understanding of the mind control language that distorts the witnesses' thinking. Would you train missionaries in the Scriptures and then send them to China without also teaching them the Chinese language? Of course not. By the same token, you should not expect success if you try to take the gospel to Jehovah's Witnesses without first studying the JWE's language. This volume will give you the basic information you need. So I'm putting this in the basic library for JWs, Jehovah-talk, the mind control language of Jehovah's Witnesses. I'll put in a link to how I left JWs and landed softly. My story is quite unusual compared to most witnesses because I was raised Christian, became a witness, and then drifted out gradually. This is not the history of most of our audience, who seem to have been somewhat traumatized in their later stages of witness life, after most of them being lifelong witnesses. I'll also put in a link to the basic JW library playlist. See you next time.